We are beginning the second Parshat Etchanan ve'Eschanan. It is a jam-packed Parsha. Moshe continues in his directive and teaching to Bnei Israel, his long, nearly 40-day goodbye speech. And as we discussed in the introduction, that we have two perspectives of what happens in this. Is this all the introductory musar and directive of sort of like the theology teaching of Moshe, or does he switch into a certain aspect of the mitzvah teaching of Moshe? Multiple opinions here, and we will see where that switch happens. But I'd like to quickly go through some aspects. Well, maybe not so quickly, but go through some aspects of the Parsha, some of the things we'll see, and then we'll come back to highlight a number of points. Moshe begins with his sadness of where he begged and hoped and yearned to go into Eretz Israel, and pleaded with Hashem, but Hashem said that it is not to be. You will not go into the land. Yehoshua, you will command him and strengthen him and encourage him to be the guide, but you will go up to the mountain and only see the land. You will see the land, but you will not go in. And there's a question as to what value is there to see it. Moshe wanted to see the land because he wanted to see sightseeing. He wanted sightseeing. What purpose was there for Moshe to go into the land? He wanted to experience the land, the holiness, the connection, the promise, and seeing it. What value does that have? There's a lot of teaching around that. But just one thought about when we have a vision of something. Moshe was able to see Am Yisrael beyond where he led them. And that's a part of what we'll see here. He took them through a tremendously difficult journey. And as he says later, we left a smelter that broke us down. But with that, we became stronger. And with that, we became, it's a kur habarzel, the metal that came out, forged from there, was greater and stronger. But it was a struggle. And we struggled throughout 40 years in the desert. We made many mistakes. And here, he's at the cusp of bringing them to the promised land. At the cusp of bringing them into Eretz Israel, into the place of Einei Hashem Elokecha, he says later, the eyes of Hashem are on it from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. This is an enormously elevated place. Moshe yearns to go there himself. And Hashem says, you can't bring them there. Yehoshua, it must go on. It must be taken to the next, and the next generation has to do that. But you will be able to see that. Your vision will allow you to see the continuity and the land and its fulfillment. That is the bracha to Moshe. There are so many times where we yearn to see something. We yearn to do something, to be able to know that this will continue. And this is Moshe. It continues to be Moshe, Torah Moshe, the Torah that Moshe teaches us today, because we continue to learn from the teaching of Moshe. And therefore, it is a necharot. You can see it. You will be able to see that which you cannot attain yourself. You will be able to see beyond your own reach to where this Torah that you teach and you give over to Yeshua will continue to bring to Bnei Israel. Then he mentions the Baal Peor. They sat at Peor. And at 4 over here, chapter 4 begins where, according to some, they see a switch here where he turns into mitzvah. Whereas up until now, it was telling them the journey and the struggle. Here he turns into mitzvah. Others say, no, this is a part of the struggle and a part of the journey. And we'll sort of try and look at it from these both angles. In chapter 4, Va'ata Yisrael shema el hachukim ve'al mishpatim asher anochi malamed etchem la'asot. And now you, Yisrael, and as we mentioned, as typically Am Yisrael is called Bnei Yisrael, children of Israel, Bnei Yisrael, which means the individual people within the community, within the congregation, within the nation. The word Yisrael alone, not Bnei Yisrael, children of Israel, but Yisrael is the nation as an entity, the nation as a single unit. So now Yisrael, you as a single unit, hear the mitzvah. So this is the interpretation of where this is not yet a change to mitzvah, but rather this is still the journey, because he's not talking to the individual, which is what you'd expect if he was saying, here's the mitzvah, the law that must be observed. Rather, it's the general, it's a general idea. You as a people, you, the entity Israel, must recognize that you didn't become a nation in a land, as is typically the case. You became a nation with the Torah. You became a nation with a mission. As nomads in a desert, you became a nation. And that's unique because for the most part, nations are forged in a boundary. And you became a nation. You va'ata Yisrael. Now, here, in a desert, outside of borders, with no land, you are already Yisrael. You are already a nation. Therefore, hear what makes you a nation. The call, hearing the call of the chukim and mishpatim, of the statutes and the laws, which are being taught to you today, so that you may live and eventually inherit land. So Moshe is still continuing in explaining the journey and the struggle to become the people that we need to be. If it is the turn and change to actually begin introducing mitzvot, so he is saying you have to be a listening people. You have to be a people that is indeed ready to hear that which you're obligated to do. And this will bring you into that. Do not add nor subtract to the mitzvah. And this is an important aspect of recognizing rabbinic fences around mitzvah. Let's read a paragraph from Rav Hirsch on this verse, because it is an important understanding in when we look at fences, at gezeros and takanos that Chazal make in order to ensure that Torah lasts and Torah is able to be upheld. It must be within the lines of this verse. Here. According to Rambam in Mamrim 2:9, the prohibition stated here includes also a warning to the sages of Israel who enact enactments and fences in order to safeguard observances of the mitzvah, and thus fulfill the duty of Ushmartem Mishmarti, see Vayikra 18:30. They are warned here not to make it appear as these are biblical in nature and an integral part of Torah, which apply of the Oraita, of a Torah obligation, and as such would be an Hosafa, in addition to Torah. Rather, they are obligated to make it clear that these mitzvahs apply as rabbinic mitzvahs, and their whole essence is a siyag, a fence, and serving as a safeguard to the mitzvah. And therefore, they must, in the construction of this enactment, must have a differentiation between the biblical and the rabbinic to show that it is not rabbinic. Our sages abided by this warning in their traditions and explanations, and with meticulous care distinguished between the Oraita and the Rabbanan. And it is important for us, and often when we don't know those distinctions, we just assume that is all if this is what we do, this is from the Torah, or it's all rabbinic, and we have to know that there are Torah obligations, rabbinic obligations, or rabbinic fences, and to know the distinction within that mitzvah itself. He now brings a juxtaposition between the tragic story that happened with the Midianite women and the Baal Pa'or, which was a deity there, and our relationship with Hashem. And if we have time, as Hashem, at the end, we'll come back to this. But he makes the distinction between those two. In verse 3, he says, "Your eyes saw which happened at the Baal Pa'or. For all those that went after the Baal Pa'or were desolate, destroyed." And there, if we look at Baal Pa'or, there's a term that says, "Vayitzamdu leBaal Pa'or," and they became attached to Baal Pa'or. Here, there's a distinction, and he says, "Va'atem," but all of you, hadvekim b'Hashem, who cling, who adhere to Hashem, chayim kulchem hayim, you are alive. He's making a distinction between vayitzamdu, that they attach themselves to Baal Pa'or, and devekim, two terms of attachment, of connecting, and what's the distinction? Because one leads to death. Pa'or is a vast opening that swallows something in, an abyss. Baal Pa'or, attachment to that brings no life. But you who cling to Hashem, you do live. That brings life. So I'll just point out that connection, that distinction or comparison, and then hopefully we can elaborate as we go through later. I want to, in chapter 4 here, he makes some predictions and wants people to recognize themselves how unique our story is. Re'eh, see, and this is not a vision, but see within your mind. Focus on this. I taught you all these laws, and you will guard them, and this is your wisdom, and the nations will recognize your wisdom on account of this. Great. And then he says, for who is a nation like this? A nation that God is close to us whenever we call. And who is a nation that is so great that has these laws? But don't forget all that you had. The days that you stood at Sinai. The understanding of who we are in history is something that Moshe wants to recognize. This is not a personal journey, and this is not just a national journey. This is the journey of the world. And you have to see that the nations of the world will grow from this. This is going to be a wisdom that the world will be able to learn from. And they will see and absorb and attach themselves to. The prophecies of Isaiah and that ultimately utensils of war will become utensils of putting the world together and building. It's a national, an international yearning, but it is a teaching that we have to live up to ourselves, and we are supposed to herald to the world. And that's the message Moshe is saying. When you come to Torah, you must see yourself as a national entity that really is there for international and for the world's betterment. Don't forget Torah. Don't forget the day you stood at Sinai. So there is a commandment here. Moshe says that we have to remember the purpose of Torah in our lives, and he brings the prohibition of idolatry and not to make images of anything divine that you may have seen or thought you saw. And here he gets into exile. Pasuk Chaf Hey. And in this part of the journey, he tells us about the historical place of Am Yisrael. And that prediction is so fascinating because it's so counterintuitive and tells us the immense strength of this prophecy of the truth of Torah. You'll become old in land. This we're in chapter 4, verse 25. And this is, by the way, the reading we do on Tisha B'Av morning, a sad reading because it ultimately it is connected to Tisha B'Av in our exile, but it is an important one because it teaches us the enigma of the Jew, that in spite of all of the exile, we are here today. So you will have descendants in the land, and they will grow old, and they will become destructive to the message, to the purpose of Am Yisrael. And I testify before you, heaven and earth, that you will be lost from the land. So Moshe tells them, upon entering the land, it will not last. Ultimately, you will, not ultimately, but you will, in this journey, along the journey, be exiled. And in that exile, you will be amongst many different nations. And you will remain very few. And that is a contradiction within and of itself. People can remain an entity in a foreign land when they are a sizable number. Here the Torah says you will not be lost within those nations you go to, but you will remain a tiny percentage. And that's a fascinating prediction that no human can make, because it is so counterintuitive and contradictory. And not only that, so you say, well, maybe the reason why we will remain strong where we are and remain who we are, where we are exiled, is because we'll be able to maintain our Torah and our distinct self. It says, no, it's not true. You will become idolaters there as well. You will assimilate and become a part of those nations, and yet you will remain who you are. That's fascinating, because the verse says, 29, and you will seek out God from there, and you will find him because you will seek him with all your heart and all your soul. And you will return to Hashem, up unto Hashem your God, and he will hear he will hear your voice. He's a compassionate God, etc. Here, Moshe is telling Am Yisrael, I want you to know your place in history, which is so unique. You will always remain a tiny portion of the nations that you are amongst. And you will be exiled, and you will assimilate, and you will lose your own vision. And nevertheless, you will be a guiding force within the world you go to. It's a fascinating and really, if someone were to say this prior to seeing our history, would say, how can you predict something like that? That we will still be here in 2020, in Portland, Oregon, or in Sydney, Australia, in Chisinau, Moldova, or in Baku, Azerbaijan, right? There are Jews learning Torah. It's an unbelievable part of history, and it's predicted by Moshe upon coming to the land, and that's because it's inextricably connected to our Torah, which is we are to bring Torah through our living, not through proselytizing, but through our living and through our being, through the chachma of Torah, to bring the messages of goodness to the world at large. Another fascinating thing that he says here is there, he wants Moshe to tell their children, and this is in 32. When you ask about history, history will tell you that there has not been nor will there be a revelation to all of mankind, to all of a nation. And all other claims of revelation of God to a people, it's always to a single person or minority people who, but never like this. And check all of history from the past to the future, and no one will make such a claim. Moshe says this to them because he wants them to be able to tell their children the story that we experienced, and we are telling you, Matan Torah, Ma'amad Har Sinai, that we cannot forget. You must know that this is unique and distinct to all, from all other revelations. All other revelations were to individual people, a small group of people. Here it's not so. God spoke to each and every one of you, le'einechem, to your eyes. You experienced it. I didn't experience it and come to you and say, God spoke to me. You all experienced it. And that's what's unique, and therefore it cannot be claimed again and won't be. Therefore, in 35, it says, Ateh har'eta ladat. You were shown so that you can know this. You saw it with your eyes, and that's where your knowledge is from. Ki Hashem hu Elokim, ein od milvado. That Hashem is God, and there is none other. This is really the full sentence of what Hashem Echad, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, is there to tell the next generations. You have seen, and therefore know, and therefore Shema, let your descendants know by hearing. Tell them the Shema that Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, Hashem Elokim and Od Milvado. Moshe wants to refute old ancient ideas of idolatry, which is that there are a plethora of powers at struggle. And God is just a term for a particular power at struggle with another. And therefore you have seen to know Ein Od Milvado. There is only one. What seems good to you and what seems bad to you are all emanating from the one good. That unique difficulty, paradox in our minds, it's only a paradox in our mind, but that paradox in our mind of how can there be what seems to be bad emanating from the source of all goodness, that is what Moshe is attempting to address here. Ki Hashem Elokim ein od milvado. There is no other but Hashem, and you hear that, and you saw that, and you know that from your own experience of seeing Hashem. By the way, stop me at any point with questions either on what I'm saying or the Parsha. This is, if no one stops and asks anything, I'm going to continue going. Yeah. There's a question on the next section, 41 to 40 to 43, 44, seems to be completely out of place. Moshe says, and then Moshe separated refuge cities for manslaughter to run away. I mean, it seems totally out of place. The simplest interpretation, which is not very satisfactory, is that after Moshe understands that he's not going to take the people into the land, because Hashem says you won't go into the land. Okay, so he says, okay, guys, you guys are going to go into the land, and you're not going to remain in the land, but this is your message to the world, etc. And now I got to go, and I got to do my last mission and set these refuge cities, because I'm not going to make it to the land, so I have to do at least the ones on the outside. So it's a very technical and sort of like a practical thing, but is for me very unsatisfactory in what this is doing here. I'll leave it at a question, or what is this section in chapter 4, verses 41, 43? What's it doing in this soliloquy Moshe is giving Am Yisrael about their history and their mission in the world? That brings us to chapter 5, where Moshe again calls Kol Yisrael, all of Yisrael, and he speaks to them the laws and the statutes, tells them that it's a covenant, and it's a covenant not only with us, but a covenant with the generations. And you saw and experienced the revelation at Sinai, and he repeats the 10 Commandments, which, by the way, is a misnomer. How many mitzvot in the 10 Commandments? In Hebrew, it's actually Aseret HaDibrot, which is the 10 statements. How many mitzvot? Anybody want to take a guess? Or you've heard this from me?
Is it 9?
No, it's more than 10. 14.
14.
14 commandments in the 10 statements. Yeah. So it's just a nice factoid trivia for your friends. How many commandments in the 10 commandments? Yeah. It's 10, give or take. Yeah. Okay. So Moshe here repeats the 10 Commandments. As we know, the wording is slightly different. A few changes. Seemingly, Moshe didn't have a text to cross-reference, so he just it was writing from memory. No. Obviously, that's Jacob's giving me the eyes like, what are you talking about, Steve? Yeah. Obviously, what these are two of the same, and Moshe, the word change between one and the other are the same exact messages in another aspect, and hence the Midrash tells us that they are these are statements that were said both at the same. They came from Hashem's mouth at the same time. Zachar and Shamar at the same time. They were spoken by Hashem and heard at the same time, things that cannot be physically attained. The idea is that the remembrance of Shabbos and the guarding of Shabbos are one and the same. Keeping Shabbos by not transgressing a technical transgression without making it holy is missing Shabbos. Somebody slept through 25 hours of Shabbos and didn't do any technical transgressions. They didn't have Shabbos because they didn't have Zachor. And having Zachor without having Shamor is also missing the essence of Shabbos. The purpose of Shabbos is not just a rest. It is a spiritual a sanctuary in time, a connection with Hashem. It is a remembrance of creation and Exodus and our connection with Hashem in our daily living. So hopefully you're familiar with the Aseret HaDibrot. We'll go quickly after that. Moshe then reminds the people, explains that which they heard and that which they saw, the enormity of the experience, but does not want them to forget the message of it itself. And in 6, again, he starts, and this is the mitzvah, the chukim hamishpatim, the mitzvah, the statutes and the laws. So we have 3 chapters in a row, really Moshe introducing the laws and the statutes. And so with each one, there's going to be a question, what is he adding to the previous one? What has he not told us that this new level of mitzvah is introducing? So here he introduces 2 aspects that are important. Lama'an tira et Hashem Elokecha, so that you may fear or be in awe of Hashem your God, as a motivation to keep the Torah and the mitzvahs and to command your children, so that there will be long life after you, and you will Shama'ata Yisrael, you as a national entity Yisrael, you will hear it, v'shamarta lasot, and you will guard to do it, as you have have been promised in order to bring to the land. So in this previous level, it was the fear of God, the awe of the divine. But here we get to va'ahavta, the love of God. And this part of Moshe's teaching here is perhaps the most well-known of the verses of the Torah. Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel. Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, Hashem, our God, Hashem is one. That is the introduction to people's lives, babies from the start and the last breath of people for our generations. This has been the lifeblood and the what we hold on to, those that are most devout and connected, and those that perhaps are the farthest that they can feel to Hashem. Nevertheless, this is the call of the Jew. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. The idea that there is only one power, and that which is good and that which is difficult, all emanating from Hashem Echad. And we hear that because those that stood at Sinai told us this. Shema Yisrael, hear it, perceive it, and make it your life's call. And this is not just the theology of, well, that's great, there's a divine out there, but rather the recognition that ultimately there is a good. And ultimately that good will prevail, and we must be a part of it. The question of whether Hashem Echad will be revealed is not a question in our mind, but rather, will we be a part of that? Will we allow ourselves to grow to be a part of that Hashem Echad? Just teaching a Rashi and something I heard from my father many years ago. Rashi says, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem, who is our God, Hashem Echad, will ultimately be the God of all people. Right now, or it's already spread, there are other nations as well who have accepted the monotheistic one God of Abraham. But ultimately, for that to be the perfection of the world, all nations will get to that place. So Hashem, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem who is our God, Hashem Echad, ultimately will be the God of all nations. When we say the Shema, we add something that's not in the verses. The verse goes Shem Echad va'ahavta, but we add Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuso La'olam Va'ed. Blessed be the name Kavod Malchuso, the honor of his kingdom of Hashem La'olam Va'ed, forever. So my father would teach me several times when I was a child. This is the thought of Shema. This is what we add. Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad will be the God of the world, and therefore it is incumbent upon us to Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuso, to enlarge, to bless the name of Hashem in kingdom, by if we can live our lives with the kingdom of Hashem on us, the honor of Hashem on us, and that will bring about this Hashem Echad for the rest of the world. And that is our message to ourselves. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuso. Go ahead and bless Hashem's name through your action, through your living, to bring that to the world as well. Just a technicality on the word va'ahavta. We often say va'ahavta, which means, and you once loved God, which is the wrong pronunciation. Va'ahavta, and you loved. That's wrong. Va'ahavta, and you shall love. You must love God, and not just love God. B'chol levavcha, with all your heart, v'chol nafshecha, with all your soul, v'chol ma'odecha, and with all your very, with all of everything you have, meaning with all your power. Can you command someone to do an action? Sure. Can you command someone to do, to have an emotion? No, you cannot. You cannot command an emotion. And yet, right here, there is a command to have an emotion. How can that be? And not only have that emotion, have it to the nth degree. B'chol nafshecha v'chol modecha, with all your heart, all your soul, with everything. To add to that challenge, we just said, even when things are tough, to recognize that Hashem is one. And that's the emotion we have to have. Love Hashem with all your heart and all your soul and all your everything you have. How's that possible? So Rambam, in his Guide to Perplex, Mar Nevuchim asked this question. The question is really in a midrash already, and it's alluded to in the Gemara. Rabbi Meir seems to be asking that question, but explicitly asked in this elaborate way. It is asked so by Rambam. And Rambam answers in a lengthy way. In short, and this is also a teaching of Rabbi Meir that we'll see later as well. When we recognize at every moment what we have in what Hashem gave us, we would automatically love. That's what Rambam says. The reason we cannot be commanded to have an emotion is because emotions are a response to particular interactions or engagements. That's what the emotional response is. And that's what the emotion is. It's a response. And the reason we have a difficulty with v'ahavta, and you shall love Hashem with all your heart, is because we don't focus on the blessings we have. And when I say we, I don't mean any of you. I'm sure you all focused on all the blessings you have, but we don't. As we take so many things for granted. We wake up in the morning, and there's a traditional prayer of Modeh ani lefanecha. I thank you, Hashem, Melech Chai V'Kayim, the living God, the living King. Right? To wake up in the morning with an appreciation. To have, imagine life without coffee. Right? It's got to be a good God if he made coffee. Right? The world could have been black and white and its color. We have all of these ability to see so many colors. It's true, other creatures can see more colors, but we can see all this color. It's not monochrome. Symphony of music. We can hear different tones. And that's just the cherries on the top. Those are the icing. Not even my heart's pumping. I have capillaries to bring blood and life to my biggest organ. I can breathe in and allow for oxygen to come through my body. I allow. My lungs are bringing that. Little tiny things are expanding, taking the oxygen. And as the blood passes through, it goes in and brings it to the rest of my body. These are amazing things just with my own body. If I were to appreciate that, it would be easier for me to love God. And therefore, Moshe says, if you look at this, yes, it is easy to, not easy, but it is easy to fall into the first step of, I do the mitzvah because I fear God. And not fear God necessarily for the retribution, that's the lowest type of fear, but fear God because I don't want to break the rules, because I don't want to do what's wrong, because I want to do what's right. In the same way where I tell my kids, don't make noise, it's past 11 o'clock, I'm afraid to wake the neighbor. Not because of the retribution, but because that would just not be neighborly. That would be wrong. So that's a level of fear, but there's much more. It would be Not I'm afraid. We like our neighbor. We love our neighbor. Let's be kind. That v'ahavta. That requires a constant thought of what is it that we have. And then we will rarely see we would rarely think that the blessings are outweighed by the hardships. We will recognize that the blessings so far, vastly, immensely outweigh the hardships. But we take them for granted. That I have sight, of course. Everybody has sight. That I can breathe. Well, everybody can do that. That I can move and stretch however and whenever I want. Sure, everybody can do that. But my fingernail hurts. And I'm not trying to make trivial of serious things. There are serious things going on individually and communally and in the world. But if we want to have v'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, we must recognize the entirety of the picture. Hashem Elokeinu, the good, and the what seems troubling and difficult. Hashem Echad, it all emanates from the one goodness. Not only is it there for ultimate goodness, but we have to love Hashem in recognizing that all the blessing we have. And in recognition of that, we will be able to overcome also the challenges and the difficulties. So this is an important part, and we must say this at all times when we get up and we go to sleep, when we come in and when we go out, and it should be tied on our arms and heads and written on our doors. And then when you come to the Eretz Israel, you will find cisterns full and lands, vineyards, and it's a built-up land. Remember, you were once slaves and taken out of Egypt. And it's important to remember it because you have to do va'asita hayasher v'atov. I want to touch on, I'm beyond the time, but I just want to touch on, we're just a few days from Tisha B'Av. And it's a national day of mourning, not only for the past, but also for the present. Not only for the loss of Yerushalayim and the temple, the Beis HaMikdash of 2,000 years ago, but the troubled state of Am Yisrael and the world today. And sometimes we forget where we've come from. You're going to come to a land that has everything made for you. You have all the blessings in the world. And then you forget where you came from. You forget that you were slaves in Egypt and Hashem took you out. You forget the journey that brought you to this place. And as a result, you want to just throw it all away. You forget the mission you have. Shamar tishmeru et mitzvahs Hashem veidosav v'chukosav asher tzivach. Remember to guard and keep the mitzvahs and all the commandments. Va'asisa va'yashar va'atov. Remember to not only do the law, but to go beyond, to do what is upright and good for every human. How do I know what's upright and good? Be'enei Hashem. Do what is good and upright in the eyes of Hashem. Focus. Right? The difficulty is, well, others also say they're doing what's so good and upright in the eyes of Hashem. Study Torah. Look at the word, look at the sources. Allow for that to penetrate and be your guide. Moshe is telling Am Yisrael, you're going to have troubled times. Allow this to guide you so that you know what is good and upright. The last part, Moshe, is the famous verse from the Haggadah. When your children ask you tomorrow, what are these statutes, laws, etc., and you will tell them we were slaves in Egypt, etc. So this is the mitzvah of remembering where we've come from and Tzedakah tiyalanu. This will be a righteousness. It's tzedakah to you when you remember this and keep the Torah on account of this. We are out of time. That's the end of the Parsha where he says, you're going to come amongst the nations. Be careful not to assimilate. Be careful to hold on to the Torah. Yasher koach. Sorry that we got cut off midway.
Yasher koach.
Thank you.
Yasher koach.
Thank you.
Yasher koach, Rabbi.
Sure.